Lucian Cernat, who is the head of global trade regulations and international procurement negotiations for the European Commission. And he will be talking to us about trade policy and the impact and the importance of trade policy with respect to our global economy. I'd like to first of all welcome Lucian to the program.
Thank you, Adriana. It's a real pleasure to be part of this series, and I think it's an incredible service you do to the international community to allow us experts around the world to interact and discuss issues that affect us all across all societies around the world. So many thank you for the invitation. Far, we've seen an unprecedented crisis from this global pandemic, actually a double crisis. We had a massive threat on our global health. We had multiple casualties. We've had massive fatalities around the world, in particular in the United States, and but also in Europe and elsewhere. But at the same time, also a massive economic crisis. It is one of the most severe crises we have had in recent history. It's probably the worst economic crisis since World War II. Even if we were to compare it with what was until now the most difficult time we passed through the economy, like in 2009, the global financial crisis, we see that even compared to that historical landmark, nowadays our economies have contracted even more. I think it's important for our listeners and viewers to understand the severity of this crisis, to have a quick look at one of the most important indicators that we at the European Commission have been using over time to understand the trends in our economies in the near future. So as we try to compare the evolution of our economic sentiment, it's called economic sentiment indicator, and it tracks the level of activity, of economic activity over time in several sectors. So you could see, for instance, here that since the beginning of the recording of this indicator, this is the worst moment in our history, even compared to the great financial crisis in 2008, 2009. For most of the sectors that have been separated and analyzed in detail, industry, services, construction, and consumers, retail, trade, etc., you will see that in April of this month, the plunge, the economic severity of the crisis was unprecedented. The good news is that we see now in June, and hopefully this trend will continue, we see a rapid bounce back.
And do you think that will continue? We don't know.
We are, I think, dependent upon the fundamental parameter behind the crisis. Let's not forget that this is not a real economic crisis like the financial crisis. This is a health crisis. So in order to understand what's going to happen to the economy, we would need to keep an eye on the way in which you contain the virus, because I think that is the one that will have an impact on the economy. The reason why the economy went so badly, really off the charts, was because we lived for many months through what people call the Great Lockdown. Now we have starting to gradually ease those restrictions, and the economy is bouncing back, because in many respects there was nothing wrong with the fundamentals in our economies. So it is encouraging to see that, at least for a few months, if we manage to walk on this fine line of making sure that we contain the number of cases, that we shouldn't have too many new contagion cases, and we will have our health system able to cope with the pressure, which is still there, I think the economy will gradually recover. So we're confident that perhaps next year we will go back to positive economic recovery. So it's important to be optimistic, but also very, very cautious, and to make sure that we put in place all the necessary economic stimulus measures that we have actually already started to make preparations for. We have a very ambitious European budget with an unprecedented economic stimulus package. We live in exceptional times, and I think our European response has to also be exceptional and extraordinary. And having 750 billion euros ready to inject in those parts of the economy that need the most support, I think will put us on a positive path.
It's huge. I mean, I think about the countries that, the emerging countries and the developing countries. And, this is one of the big concerns because this is, as you mentioned, this is like a war. This is affecting everyone, every country and all sectors. And that is really what is different here. And unless we work together, there are going to be some countries, I guess, and some people that are more vulnerable. And, it's a very, very difficult time.
I would like to fully agree with what you said about the impact of the crisis on the developing world. We've seen many developing countries being hit rather disproportionately in a way, perhaps a bit later than us, but still in a very severe way. And there's one thing that we need to keep in mind is that for around 80 countries around the world, the EU market, the 500 million European consumers, are the main driving force for their economic prosperity as well. They depend on exports towards our market. And when our consumption collapsed, like the indicator I've just shown earlier with a massive decline in economic activity, countries who depend on the European market for their sales and their economic activity, they've also taken a huge hit. We are fully aware of that, and our economic response will try to the best of our ability to remain a global stimulus package. We do not want to stimulate our economy to the detriment of other economies. In reality, the first thing that recovered after the crisis was European imports. Our exports did not recover very well. Actually, our exports are still lingering in sort of a negative zone. My team predicted earlier on in May a -15, up to -15 decline in European exports. That's almost half a trillion. If you translate it into euros, it's about half of a trillion, 500 billion. And if you translate this into jobs, because behind these billions of euros of exports, there are real people with their jobs dependent on these sales abroad. We are probably, in Europe, we're looking at between 4 and 7 million jobs that are at risk. So we're fully aware of the real implications for many of our citizens from this crisis. And we're also aware that elsewhere in the world, other people are equally affected. But the good news, as I said, is that the first thing that recovered in Europe was consumption and also imports. So the first good news went from Europe to those developing countries that depend on us.
You mentioned something very important, that this is unlike other crises that we've seen in the past in the sense that it is built around the health. And if we can manage the pandemic and this great lockdown, we will be able to restart. And what you're indicating is really important because any changes that you make do have ramifications on a global scale. And for your own business, it may not necessarily be the right steps to take. It may, changing everything requires a lot of time and a lot of money. And unless it's necessary, that may not be the right way to go right now. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, indeed. I think to some extent, these open-ended questions are legitimate. We are in a pandemic and people want to draw the right lessons and be better prepared for next time around when such a global shock will hit us. And I think it's legitimate to at least ask the questions, but we should also ensure that we give the right answers and the correct answers. I think it's important to remember that before the crisis, we were living in GVC times, if we can call it that way, in global value chains, sort of globalized economy. Everything was part of a very well-oiled machinery with companies and countries specializing on the basis of their comparative advantage. We are all trying to make the most out of it, exchanging goods and services in order to make it more efficient for all of us and make it a win-win. So for many decades, this was a golden age for the global economy where many countries, including developing countries, managed to lift millions of people out of poverty based on these global supply chains. I think there's probably no better way to explain how important was this mantra and this important philosophy of made in the world than to show, as I was trying to put in one of my slides, an iconic American product. Is an American product made in the world. So here a chart, if you would take a screwdriver and try to disassemble a Boeing and its spare parts, and you would look at the label on each of them and say, where does this come from? You would see that many of the parts that are actually making such a fine product, a winner around the world, are actually made in many countries by many companies who work together in a perfect supply chain. Boeing, above all, is probably one of the best manager of a complex, very wide supply chain. You see on this chart, for instance, probably more names of companies that are outside America than American suppliers. I'm sure there are many other American suppliers, but this is just to say that it is clear that for complex products, we live in a world where supply chains were the norm. And that probably will remain the case, even though nowadays we hear people calling for nearshoring or reshoring or for having a plan B. These are all legitimate questions, but one thing in my view will remain as valid as before after the COVID crisis, that we will have to work together along supply chains. And beyond these company examples, I think what is important, and that's what we already did so far, was to ask ourselves, okay, we live in global supply chain times, but are these global supply chains resilient? Are they too concentrated? Are we vulnerable in some of these supply chains in a way that would require some corrective measures by the business sector or by policymakers?
I think that's a really important point because, as you mentioned, it's not only our Boeing airplanes, it's our blue jeans, to be honest. I mean, you know, the American-made blue jean actually has the dye from one country, the thread from another, the buttons from somewhere else. I mean, what's important is for businesses to be able to map this. You know, there may be high costs for non-delivery or where there are high penalties. And especially with the pandemic, what countries are having what issues? Now, your next chart is actually showing us how to do that. And I think that's another very, very interesting and very important part.
Indeed, I think even though we were confident that the global supply chains were a permanent feature of our trading system, because we were not faced with such a trade apocalypse. We had to go through such an apocalypse to actually ask ourselves some of the questions that probably we should have asked ourselves before. We probably did have some blind spots. Mm-hmm. The global supply chains were so well running, all oil. They really didn't have the need for any intervention. So policymakers probably did not feel the need to invest in the kind of things that I'm showing to you now. But in the crisis, we did have to ask ourselves to what extent our supply chains are subject to certain vulnerabilities. And here I use a very simple, very basic metric to measure vulnerability. If one particular product would be imported from a sole supplier, that would be a sign of vulnerability. If you have a plan B, if you have multiple sources for the same product around the world, if something wrong happens with one of your suppliers, you will always be able to turn around and probably source more from another source if you have it at hand. So here is a chart where we took literally all our products. In Europe, at this level of detail, we have around 9,000, a few more, 9,000, 10,000 products. So it's really the full spectrum of everything we import. So you see all the number of products on a vertical scale and then the number of suppliers. And the question is, from how many countries do we import each and every product in Europe? And the chart is very interesting in many ways. First, if you look at the bubble up in the left-hand corner, you see the number of products which are imported from a sole supplier, the ones I mentioned that as being probably the most vulnerable, for which our European companies have no plan B at the moment. So you see that we have roughly around 250 products.
Right here, right.
Exactly, right there. About 250 products which are imported from a sole supplier. But then you also see on the chart that the green line separates the product spectrum of all the imports into half. You have on the left-hand side products which are imported from less than 25 suppliers. That's 50% of our products in number. And then on the right-hand side, you see all the other products. And again, these are the other half of our products, which are imported from more than 25 suppliers, each and every one of these products. And there's another information, the size of the bubbles, because it's not just the number of products. You need to pay attention to the money. So you would ask yourself, is a lot of trade value subject to vulnerabilities? And that's what the size of the bubble shows you. And for instance, I single out the biggest size of our trade. You see the biggest bubble indicates the kind of products which account for the largest share of our trade. And you see that for more than 10% of our trade value, we source these products from between 60 and 70 suppliers. So the bottom line, the main message of this chart is that by and large, our European supply chains are well diversified.
That's great.
We have some vulnerabilities potentially for a very small number of products, and they represent less than 1% of all our imports. So we shouldn't be too concerned, but at the same time, we cannot be too complacent. I think we need to understand the nature of these products, whether they are critical for our supply chains, and that's the next step in our analysis.
And this is actually something that an executive or a company or especially the board would want to see for every single piece of your product. You know, if your product is not in Europe, if it's somewhere else, you want to know exactly this type of information. It's very, very helpful, very useful to understand where your risk is.
Exactly. If I were the chief economist of any multinational, this is the chart that I will show to my CEO immediately. And not only this chart, I will say, look, I plotted all our suppliers and all the products we need for our production system to function. If just to give you a very concrete example, because it actually affected many companies, a natural experiment which was similar in the kind of shock that affected global supply chains like COVID was the Icelandic volcano. I don't know if you remember when the Icelandic volcano erupted. That was a huge disruption for those supply chains that relied on air transport. So many of these automotive global supply chains, the automotive sector is one of the most globalized, the most dependent on such supply chains. The automotive sector, particularly in Asia, relied for some very small but essential parts on small suppliers in Ireland. And they were shipping this particular small, it was an airbag sensor in one of the newspapers articles I read. These all airbag sensors were actually produced by a small company in Ireland, and they were shipped by plane whenever they needed to a Nissan factory in Japan. But when the Icelandic volcano erupted, the planes couldn't fly anymore. So a very tiny component for which at the time, the Japanese automotive industry had no plan B, as far as I could tell from the newspaper article. They thought it's a small component. They didn't care about a plan B. And yet, because of the airbag sensor, the whole car was actually stopped. The whole production process had to be stopped. You cannot drive a car without an airbag sensor. So this is what people have to understand, that it doesn't matter so much the value of your components. You need to have alternative supplies. You need to understand the risk. And companies who invested in these kind of natural disasters, the electronics industry is another example, with some companies being very diligent, other being a bit more casual about it. Those who invested in a plan B, in a risk management, as you said, in fact, they recovered much quickly and they didn't lose so much money.
That's extremely important. And I think you don't want to start looking for a plan B when you're in crisis. And every single company is going to be different, because what's an important widget for you may not be for somebody else. So you really need to understand your product, understand your sensitivity, and how that will impact that product.
Yeah, I think, Adriana, you really nailed it very well. You hit the nail on the head, because it is really this firm level specificity that makes global supply chains critically important. And you cannot understand global supply chains if you start aggregating and if you talk in generalities. And this is why I've been advocating for a while a new approach to trade policy, which I call Trade Policy 2.0. which should actually rely to the largest extent possible on firm level trade data. And even though you may need at some point in a critical time to rely on a plan B, if you have firm level, very good firm level data, information about the real companies, the most adequate suppliers, you would be able to jump and bounce back very quickly out of a crisis. And I have three examples, recent examples from the COVID crisis where we apply this trade policy 2.0 logic, but also encouraging signs from the United States and China, who probably, without calling it that way, they've also adopted the trade policy 2.0 example. So in the European context, what we did was, when the crisis hit us at the peak of the pandemic, many of our hospitals and national health authorities, there were many shortages of COVID-related materials. It could be protective equipment, it could be ventilators or test kits. So we at the European Commission were not mandated historically to do such things, but it was a force majeure. It was an unprecedented situation. So we wanted to help by actually identifying alternative suppliers, since the ones we knew of, they were overwhelmed with demand and they couldn't actually produce as much as people wanted of masks or ventilators. So having access to firm level data for other purposes, we re-engineered and we used that data to identify alternative suppliers. And we gave people who wanted to buy masks in our procurement department, we gave them dozens of names of companies who in the end were reliable suppliers. So I'm really hopeful that the kind of trade policy approach, this very detailed firm level trade policy approach, probably saved a few lives in Europe. And I'm very proud when I think about it. We realized that at the peak of the pandemic, countries had a kind of knee-jerk reaction. They put in place barriers and they started to segment the market. Instead of relying on supply chains, they all became national. And that made the problem even worse, because if you try to buy products from abroad, nobody is an island. Nobody can produce all the products that you need at that time. So we need to help each other and sell what you need, and I buy from you what you need, etc., etc. So now we have a global health initiative, which we have launched at the World Trade Organization. And we really want countries to understand the importance of keeping the markets free at the time when there is no crisis in particular, because this is how you build a solid basis. And all the suppliers have the confidence that they can also sell abroad and they can scale up and invest in productive capacities. And of course, it's not just about tariffs, it's about standards. You want to make sure that your thermometer or your medical equipment fits with everything else you have in the hospital. In the world of trade, another promising technology that was brought to the fore more prominently after the crisis is blockchain. Because blockchain gives you the trust. There are many players in the supply chains, both public and private companies, custom officials, regulators. They all need to trust each other and to ensure that products are safe for you and your family. So the EU blockchain for trade solution, in a way, if you wish, tries to ensure that we would have this trust and compatibility from global factories to your family. So
love the concept.
We really hope that the platform, which is going to be available for free, now we're in a pilot phase. It's far from being up and running on a large scale, but I wanted to also publicize it here with you and our audience, since I think blockchain, it's like, it takes two to tango. It actually takes more than two to do a blockchain. So we want people both in the private sector, but also different trading partners and different authorities to show interest and to allow us to create this global public good. We want this to reduce the cost of doing trade and increase transparency and trust. So reduce cost, increase transparency, increase ability of even smaller companies to participate in global supply chains.
And it makes it easier for smaller companies. Something like this actually is global. Exactly. So, well, hopefully when COVID is over, we will make it across the Atlantic, and we will visit. And I love what you do, and if we'd love to have you on again.
Thank you very much, Adriana. And once again, I would like to congratulate you for the initiative. It's really one of these platforms where people can get together and exchange ideas that hopefully will make the world a better place.
I agree. Thank you.